The bulldozers came on a Tuesday morning, before the frost had even lifted off the fence line. Margaret Doyle stood at her kitchen window with a coffee mug going cold in her hand, watching three machines tear into 60 acres that had been wild scrub and drainage woodland for as long as anyone could remember. Nobody had warned her. Nobody had asked her. The crew foreman waved at her once, almost friendly, like flattening 40 years of root systems was just another Tuesday. She didn't wave back. She set the mug down, pulled on her boots, and walked the property line with a notebook tucked under her arm. Not to argue. Not yet. Just to watch. Just to write down what she saw. Margaret was 68 years old and had farmed the same 110 acres outside Willow Creek since she was a girl trailing behind her father on an old Massey Ferguson. Her husband Tom had passed 11 years back, and since then she'd run the place alone. Corn, some hay, a small herd of Angus cattle that mostly kept her company more than they kept her solvent. The farmhouse was the same one her grandfather built in 1947, settled a little crooked now, the porch boards soft in places where water liked to collect. What people in town didn't always understand was that Margaret's farm sat in a shallow bowl. The land sloped gently from three directions down toward her lower pasture, and that scrubby woodland next door, the one everyone called the wasteland, the one nobody thought twice about, had been doing quiet work for decades. Roots holding soil, brush slowing runoff, a scatter of old drainage ditches, half collapsed and grown over, that her father always said were older than the county itself, dug by hand sometime before the Depression to keep the bowl from flooding. She'd grown up knowing that land breathed the way old land does, slow, patient, indifferent to anyone's plans. Her father used to tell her that water always finds where it wants to go, and a farmer's job wasn't to fight it, just to listen for it. She hadn't thought much about those words in years. They came back to her the morning the bulldozers showed up. The buyer was a development company out of the county seat, planning 40 new homes on a site they'd been told was underutilized agricultural land with no significant drainage function. That phrase would come back to haunt a lot of people later. For now, it was just a sentence on a permit application nobody at the township office had bothered to question too hard. Margaret didn't own that land. She had no legal claim to what happened on it. What she had was 40 years of watching water move across her own fields every spring, and a feeling in her gut that wouldn't leave her alone. She didn't sleep well that first night. She kept thinking about the ditches. 3 days after the clearing started, Margaret drove into town and asked to speak with someone at the county planning office. She got Daniel Pruitt, a planning technician in his 30s who had a stack of permits on his desk, and a meeting in 20 minutes. He was polite. He was also clearly in a hurry. "Ma'am, that parcel was surveyed," he told her, sliding a folder across the desk without quite looking up from his monitor. "Engineering firm out of Lansing signed off on the drainage assessment. Says here the historical ditch network is non-functional and the site has adequate natural absorption capacity." Margaret said she didn't think that was right. She said the ditches still ran water every spring, that she'd watched it happen her whole life, that removing the brush cover upslope from her property was going to send that water somewhere, and the only somewhere it could go was down into her bowl. Pruitt nodded the way people nod when they're waiting for you to finish, so they can say something else. "The firm that did the assessment is well regarded," he said. "If there's a problem, the developer's insurance and bonding would cover it. But honestly, Mrs. Doyle, these surveys are pretty thorough these days. I wouldn't worry." She left without raising her voice. She wasn't the type. But she also didn't believe him, not for 1 second, and on the drive home, she stopped at the feed store and bought 100 feet of nylon cord and a dozen wooden stakes. She didn't know yet exactly what she was going to do with them. She just knew watching wasn't going to be enough anymore. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table and opened a spiral notebook that still had a grocery list from October on the first page. She tore that page out, and on the clean one underneath, she wrote the date, and beneath it, started watching the Hollister tract. Want to know what the water does? It was a small thing, almost nothing, but it was the first entry in what would become, over the following 10 weeks, the most thorough piece of amateur hydrology Drummond County had seen in a generation. Margaret's mornings changed shape after that. She still fed the cattle at 6, same as always, but now she added 45 minutes to her route, out past the lower pasture, along the fence line bordering the cleared tract, down to where the old ditch crossed on her land before disappearing into a culvert under the county road. She started simple. She drove a wooden stake into the ground at the mouth of the main ditch and marked it with a strip of red tape at ground level. Every morning, rain or not, she checked whether water had reached it overnight, and if so, how high. She wrote the numbers down. Date, time, water level in inches, whether the night before. Nothing fancy. A farmer's ledger, the same instinct that made her track calving dates and feed costs for 40 years, turned now towards something nobody had asked her to measure. The first discovery came 12 days in, after a Thursday night storm dropped just under 1.5 inches of rain. She walked out at 6:15 the next morning expecting the same trickle she'd seen all week. Instead, water stood 4 inches deep against her stake, brown and moving fast, carrying loose topsoil from the cleared tract in visible streaks. She'd never seen the ditch run that high from that little rain. She wrote it down, then walked the full length of the boundary and found something else. A second, smaller drainage channel completely hidden under blackberry brambles that nobody's survey had mapped at all. It ran at an angle straight toward her lower pasture fence. She marked that one too. A second stake. A second strip of tape. The county's contracted engineering firm, meanwhile, was telling the developer something different. Their report, which Margaret eventually got a copy of through a friend who worked the front desk of the township office, stated that the cleared parcel's natural percolation rate, combined with planned grading, would adequately manage stormwater without need for retention infrastructure. It was a confident sentence. It used the word adequate twice in one paragraph. The second discovery came 3 weeks in during a dry stretch. Margaret noticed something almost by accident, a patch of ground near the property corner that stayed damp 2 full days after the rest of the cleared tract had dried out completely. She knelt down, pushed her fingers into the soil, and felt clay just below the surface where the topsoil had been scraped thin by the bulldozers. She didn't have a soil science degree. She didn't need one. She understood, the way a person who has spent a lifetime reading land understands, that clay doesn't drink water. It sheds it. And 60 acres of exposed clay subsoil, freshly stripped of root cover, sitting upslope from her bowl, was not adequate natural absorption. It was the opposite. She bought a $15 rain gauge from the hardware store in town and started cross-referencing her stake readings against actual rainfall instead of guesswork. The numbers told a story that was getting harder to ignore, at least for anyone willing to look. 1/2 inch of rain now produced runoff that, before the clearing, would have needed nearly 2 inches to generate. The brush and root systems that used to slow the water down and let it soak in were gone. The old ditches dismissed as non-functional were in fact the only things still doing any work at all, and they were being overwhelmed. The third discovery was the quietest and in some ways the most important. Going through a box of her father's old papers one evening, looking for nothing in particular, Margaret found a hand-drawn plat map from 1958, the kind township assessors used to keep before everything went digital. It showed the ditch network in detail, not as drainage ditches, but labeled plainly in faded pencil as flood relief channel, maintained by mutual agreement. There had been a legal arrangement, generations old and long forgotten, obligating whoever owned that tract to keep the channels clear. Nobody currently involved. Not the developer, not the engineering firm, not the planning office. appear to know it had ever existed. She photographed the map with her phone, wrote the date and what she'd found in her notebook, and kept going to the fence line every morning like nothing had changed. She didn't call anyone. She didn't post anything online. She just kept measuring, kept writing, kept waiting for the next rain. By early spring, the development company had moved fast. Grading was underway. Concrete trucks had started showing up for foundation work on the first cluster of homes. Daniel Pruitt's office approved the next phase of permits without much delay, and a sign went up at the entrance to the site advertising the first 6 homes as available for pre-sale, starting at $289,000 each. Margaret kept walking the fence line. The ground near her lower pasture had started staying soft longer after rain than it ever had before, and in March, after 2 days of steady drizzle that barely totaled an inch, her lower fence posts, set in ground that had been dry and stable for decades, began to lean. She straightened them, noted it in the book, and kept going. She tried the planning office one more time, this time bringing the rain gauge data and a photocopy of the old plat map. She met with a different staffer this time, a woman named Carol Whitfield, who at least looked at the papers for more than 10 seconds. Carol seemed concerned, mentioned she'd flag it for the county engineer, and Margaret left feeling slightly better than she had after the first meeting. 2 weeks passed. Nobody called. Meanwhile, the development site engineer, a competent man named Russ Aldrich, who genuinely believed in his firm's modeling, kept reassuring the township that the grading plan accounted for worst-case seasonal flow. He wasn't being dishonest. He was busy. His firm had 40 other projects running that quarter, and the software he used to model runoff had been built on assumptions about ditch capacity that nobody had field verified in years. He had no reason to drive out and stand in the mud with a $15 rain gauge. That wasn't his job. It had never occurred to anyone that it should be. By April, Margaret's notebook had 11 weeks of entries. Rainfall amounts, water depths at both stakes, soil observations, the photograph of the 1958 map, a rough sketch she'd drawn herself of where the hidden second channel actually ran, which didn't match the engineering firm's survey at all. She had documented patiently and without fanfare exactly what the official paperwork insisted did not exist. The township scheduled a routine site inspection for the 3rd week of April, mostly procedural, mostly expected to be a formality before final approval on Phase 2. Margaret heard about it from Carol Whitfield, almost as an afterthought. She wrote the date in her notebook and underlined it once. 2 days before that inspection, the heaviest rain of the season arrived, just over 2.5 inches in 14 hours, the kind of storm that came through Drummond County maybe twice a year, and that, by every official report on file, the cleared tract was perfectly equipped to handle. The inspection happened the morning after the storm cleared, and by the time the county engineer, the developer's site manager, Russ Aldrich, Daniel Pruitt, and 2 township officials arrived at the property line, there was no need for anyone to explain anything. The water did the explaining. Margaret's lower pasture stood under 6 inches of standing water across nearly 2 acres. Fence posts tilted at angles that made the cattle visibly nervous, and a brown plume of runoff still draining steadily from the hidden second channel, the one that didn't exist on any official survey, directly into her land. Beyond the property line, on the cleared tract itself, the newly graded foundation pads for 3 pre-sold homes sat partially flooded, standing water-pooled against fresh concrete that had been poured 9 days earlier. Nobody said much at first. Russ Aldrich walked the channel himself, found where it ran, found where it didn't match his firm's drainage map, and stood there for a long moment without speaking. That was the silence moment Margaret would remember most clearly afterward. Not triumph, not vindication exactly, just 5 grown professionals standing quietly in ankle-deep mud, looking at water that wasn't supposed to be there. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't need to. She handed Carol Whitfield the notebook, 11 weeks of it, along with the photocopied 1958 plat map showing the old legal obligation to maintain the flood relief channel. Carol read 3 pages, looked up, and asked who else had seen this. Margaret said nobody, just her. The numbers, once the county brought in an independent hydrologist the following week, were not subtle. The original engineering assessment had projected stormwater remediation costs of roughly $14,000 if any drainage issues arose post-construction, a contingency line item mostly there to satisfy permit requirements. The actual cost, once the developer was required to halt Phase 2, regrade the site, restore the original channel network, and install proper retention infrastructure before any further construction, came to $187,000, plus a 6-week construction delay and a renegotiation with 3 buyers who put deposits down on flooded foundation pads. Margaret's own damage, fence repair, 2 reseeded acres of pasture, a culvert under the county road that needed clearing of debris, came to $3,400, covered eventually by the developer's bonding company without a fight. Once the county engineer's report named the cause plainly, nobody apologized directly to her. That wasn't really how these things worked. But the final county report, 6 pages long, referenced long-standing, undocumented drainage infrastructure and field observations consistent with historical hydrological records, and anyone who read it closely understood exactly whose field observations those were. Word moved slowly through Willow Creek, the way it usually does in a place where everyone already half knows everyone else's business. There wasn't a dramatic town meeting or a headline in the county paper, just a steady drift of conversation at the feed store and after church, people mentioning that Margaret Doyle had apparently kept some kind of journal on the Hollister tract flooding, and that it turned out to matter more than anyone expected. Daniel Pruitt called her in May, mostly to ask permission to keep a copy of her notebook on file with the township for future reference on that parcel. He was a little more careful with her after that, though he never said much about it directly. Russ Aldrich's firm updated its drainage modeling protocols to include a mandatory field verification step for any site with undocumented historical infrastructure, a quiet, internal change that nobody outside the company ever heard about, but one that came directly from what happened on that tract. The development went forward eventually, scaled back to 32 homes instead of 40, with a proper retention pond where the hidden channel used to run, fed, and maintained now the way the old plat map had always intended. Margaret's pasture recovered by June. The cattle didn't seem to remember any of it. She didn't bring it up much. When her neighbor Ruth asked her about it over coffee one afternoon, Margaret just shrugged and said the land had been trying to tell everyone something for a while, and somebody finally had to listen. She kept the notebook in the same kitchen drawer where she kept the seed catalogs and the vet's phone number, and she started a new one that spring, mostly just for the calving season, like she always had. Life went back to its normal shape. Mornings at 6. Cattle fed. Fences checked. The only real difference was that she added one more line to her route now, a habit she didn't expect to break. Past the new retention pond, glinting quietly where the wasteland used to be, holding water exactly the way it was supposed to. If you're watching this from a small town where everyone still waves from their trucks, hit subscribe. If you've ever known someone like Margaret, quiet, stubborn, more comfortable with a notebook than an argument, you already understand why stories like this one matter. We tell these stories because the land remembers things long after the paperwork forgets them, and because someone somewhere is always still out there keeping watch. Subscribe, and we'll keep bringing you the ones worth hearing. There's a particular kind of knowledge that doesn't come from a degree or a survey, the kind that settles into a person after enough years of watching the same 100 acres change with the seasons. Margaret never thought of herself as anyone's expert. She thought of herself as someone who paid attention, because her father had taught her that water always finds where it wants to go, and the only real mistake a person can make is assuming they know better than it does. The bulldozers that came that Tuesday morning weren't acting out of malice. Nobody involved meant harm. They were busy, confident in their paperwork, trusting systems that had worked well enough most of the time. That's usually how these things happen. Not through cruelty, but through a kind of hurried certainty that doesn't leave much room for an old ditch nobody bothered to ask about. What stayed with Margaret afterward wasn't the vindication of being right. It was something quieter, the reminder that land has a memory longer than any permit, any survey, any meeting where someone says adequate twice in a single paragraph. The old channels her father once told her about had been doing their patient work for decades before anyone thought to question them, and they'd go on doing it for decades more, whether anyone wrote it down or not. She still walks the fence line every morning. Most days now, there's nothing to see, just water moving where it's supposed to, settling into the pond, behaving the way the 1958 map always said it should. She doesn't need the notebook for that anymore. But she keeps one in her coat pocket anyway, out of habit, because you never really stop watching once you've learned how much the land has to say, if someone's willing to listen long enough to hear it.